Since the day the S&P 500 was first created in 1957, what happened is it became really fast the benchmark against which everything else was compared. Problem is, if you look at the way the S&P 500 has been created and the science and the research we have about finance and what's supposed to bring us good returns, S&P 500 index doesn't really make sense, or at least the returns, the 10% returns that he had in the last few decades, doesn't really make sense at all. So today, we're going to use science, research, and what we know about finance to create a benchmark to benchmark the S&P 500 against. And you can be sure it's going to be extremely smart or borderline mental. I'm Alberto. My mission is to find the best long-term investing strategy using research, backtesting, and of course, a little bit of my own experience. And if you are ready to Jindex, then welcome to Jasper's Door. Now, to better understand if the S&P 500 will be a good choice, we're going to have to dive into what an index actually is. Now, an index is a selection criteria and the number of the stocks that will eventually end up being in the index. So if you understand that, then you will understand very fast that all indices are arbitrary. For example, at some stage, in some conference room somewhere, I guess it would be New York, someone decided that the S&P 500 was to be made with the top or the biggest 500 companies in the United States. And that once you have that in mind, once you understand that behind those people, those indices, there's people, we can start thinking of why did they go that way? What incentives did they follow? And what practicality did they need to follow in order to make that happen? So to understand better what kind of people there's behind the S&P 500, we're going to run a little bit of an exercise. The total market capitalization of the S&P is $54 trillion. And that is a lot of money. We're going to introduce Germany to this concept. Now, Germany, many of us know that is the number one economic power of Europe with $4.5 trillion outcome in terms of GDP. With that GDP, you will take 12 Germanys in order to buy every single stock in the S&P 500. So with that money behind the S&P 500, what we know for sure is that is full of the investment coming from big banks. Otherwise, no one privately would be able to get that kind of money together. And if we do have the big banks behind the S&P 500, why do the big banks choose to invest in it? And the reasons are kind of simple. So one is convenience. So the S&P 500 stocks, because they are so big, they are easy for them to invest in without moving too much the price of the underlying asset. So when you invest in a very small stock, especially if it's illiquid, if you get too much money in it, you will push the price with your own weight. You will push the price up. And you pretty much chew up your expected returns in the long and short run, actually. So that's one. They need very, very big companies to invest in. And that's why they probably started that way. And second, and this happened over time, risk aversions of the banks push them to do what everyone else is doing. The reason for that is if you lose, and this is something actually said, I believe it is, that I heard from the head of advisory of a very famous Swiss bank. And he said, we don't want to give our clients big returns. All we want is making sure they don't feel they're wrong. They lose money when everyone else isn't. So they are very ready to sacrifice big returns in order to be with the herd, be with everyone else. so that eventually they don't lose their job. If an investment that may be actually a good investment is going bad for a year or two, which is part of investing as an experience. So we have the first two incentives of why the S&P 500 is so big and it is what it is, which may not be the best way to invest. And the reason I'm saying that is because of this paper. If you never heard about this particular paper, you should probably check it out. I'm going to just add this slide to make sure you understand it's extremely well received in the world of finance, and it's famous. But for us, for the sake of this particular video, what is important? What is important in that paper is two things. First, small caps have better expected returns than big cap stocks. Now, this does not define any particular stock. It's just a characteristic that we call factor that is part of a smaller cap company. So in general, if you have an index of small caps, we expect that index to perform better than big caps over the long run, which is very important. So that's the first learning that we have from that paper. And the second is that value stocks are expected to have higher, better returns than a growth stock. But then if you revert it back and we go back to the S&P 500 here, we see how both the size of the company and the growth factor of the company play against us into the S&P 500. So we choose factors that are tilted towards something that we know will have a lower expected return. And on top of it, any ETF tracking the S&P 500 has something called rebalancing and needs to happen daily. And what that does is simply sell and buy stocks at the end of every day in order to match perfectly with the index. Now, this is a little bit more elaborate and intricate, but this buying and selling activity has costs. And I saw papers that said that you would spend up to 4% a year to keep up with those costs. I don't know if it's always 4%, but even if it's a 2%, 1%, those are hidden costs you won't see, but they are making the S&P 500 and many other ETFs that track an index so closely are less valuable. With all of that, we need to find a benchmark that shows us if the S&P 500 is a good benchmark itself. What if we build our own index with our own criteria that is tailored to our own personal goals? Now, we called it a Jindex. A Jindex is nothing else but an investable DUI index, right? Big surprise, if you can choose any roles you want and select a number of stocks that will follow those roles, that's an index, right? And if you do it yourself, well, we can start thinking about removing all of those problems that the banks gave us. So instead of following what they have to do, we can start thinking of what is good for us. And that is creating our own returns and matching our own philosophy. Obviously, there will be no fees because there's no banks involved. And we can see later on in a future video how to make rebalancing a little bit more less costly and therefore a bit more smart. Now, today's Jindex we're going to create is an S&P 500 challenger, right? And to build a Jindex, we said it before, we need to define a selection criteria, we need to define a number of stocks, and we need to establish if we want any filters or rules. And to challenge the S&P 500, I'm going to do something that is long time coming. I'm going to do something that is basic maneuvers when it comes to experimenting in science. We need something that would be, if this was medicine, would be the double blind. We need a control group. Now, to do that, I'm going to introduce a Jindex that is made of 50 random stocks. The rules are very simple. Any stocks in the world will be considered. We're going to select it randomly, and we're going to select 50 of them. We're going to rinse and refresh every 6 months. And of course, because it's random, we're not going to use one single run. We're going to run it 10 times and see if any outliers out there. We're going to exclude it. And with outliers, in this particular case, I just use anything outside of 2 standard deviation from the average. The fun fact, I had to exclude only one outlier, and it was because it went so good. It was pretty, if I don't even get me started. Let's get this. Oh, by the way, this is for the scientists out there, the statisticians out there, or even just the nerds like me that want to get out there and do it. You can have the code I used to run this experiment, and it's a simple copy paste. Even if you don't know anything about coding, it's a simple copy paste. You can copy paste it in a platform called Quant Connect. Is www.quantconnect.com. Copy paste it in there and press play, and it's all free. You can run this whole scenario by yourself. And I did that for one reason only. I like you guys, if you think I made any mistake in my reasoning, in my code, or in the interpretation of the data, please let me know. I'm human. I have no claim to be perfect. I do this because I like it. And I know this is the internet. Don't be a troll about it. But yeah, if you see any mistakes, let me know. I'll love to be better. So now, you probably want to be seated for this. What is going to happen now is simple. We're going to run 10 strategies you're going to see appearing on the screen, and the yellow line represents the average of those strategies. Your job is to keep an eye on it and think, where would the S&P 500 sit among those lines? I'm going to run it right now, and here we go. Have a sit. If you understand where this is going, the outcome of 10 different strategies that are completely random and will make or break the S&P 500, right? Again, we're thinking about the most invested index in the world versus a bunch of random stocks. Where is that going to fit? I'm going to click it now, and you're going to see where that fits compared to the S&P. Ready? What? If you're confused, if you are out of words, if you think the S&P 500 should be beating 50 random stocks over the last 25 years, I empathize with you. I understand completely. This is how I felt for months after this came up. And if you look at it, actually, there's something I want. Let me take this chance to show something. If you look at it again, and you look at how the S&P 500 shared space on the graph with the average, what you can see is that first few years, the S&P 500 dropped quite consistently. It actually goes down something around 50%. And that is because of the dot-com bubble that was happening in the early 2000s. This particular set of events is one of the best way to explain how investing really depends on when you start. The thing is, you should always start. Like, you never have, if something is sure in finance, is that the earliest you start, the more you compound. The problem is you don't know what is going to happen next. And in this particular case, against the S&P 500 joy and returns, what happened is it just went down in a period where the random average didn't. And that made the S&P 500 a chaser. And that is exactly what happened at the very end when the Magnificent Seven start taking control over the S&P 500. And what happens is it just pushes the price so high that it takes up and closes that gap. And even after 25 years, you can see the actual average return remains pretty much the same. Now, we know the S&P 500 is an American index. So it would just make sense to run the same experiment, but instead of globally, we're only going to use US stocks. And the thing is, in hindsight, we already know that US stocks had really, really good returns in the last 20 years, also from 2009 onwards to 2025. So here we go.
No, all right. I know that sounds bad.
If you feel like mad now, I fully understand it. This is mental. This is absolutely mental. 12% returns over the last 25 years compared to a measles 7. And again, we still have that thing where the first few years are very bad for the S&P 500, and therefore there's a reason why the random index looks so good. So in order to play clean, what we're going to do now is to change the way the graph is presented, and instead of having a linear y-axis where you present the number growing in a linear fashion, we are going to present it in a logarithmic scale. Logarithmic scale is to say that it grows exponentially. And what it does to the line is very simple. If you pick any 2 points on the line, the gradient, the slope in between those 2 points represents the rate of return. Okay, so parallel lines, as you can see from 2010 to COVID to 2020, parallel lines represent equal rate of return for that period, right? So you can see the S&P 500 in this particular configuration where we start at 2000 has just been very unlucky because we pick a time where the dot-com bubble ruined everything for it. And in the same similar way, this is something every investor should be aware of. In the last few years, the Mag 7 just pushed the price higher, and you can see the S&P 500 slowly making back to its dominant position. Now, what do we think about this? First of all, let me see what I mean in practice by using a 2010 compared to 2010 instead of 2000. And you can see pretty much what we get is a similar result up to the very last few years. And this is the comparison of the two graphs. Now, what do we get out of this? Well, the S&P 500 has returns that are very, very similar, comparable to an index that is made out of random stocks. Do you still think you should invest in the S&P 500? Again, do you still think, or maybe you probably start thinking, should I just go random? I would suggest you not to go random. That's crazy. But don't blindly trust anyone either, especially if comes from a bank. Rest assured that your best interest is not taken into consideration. So remember that everyone has his own incentives and they are very important. So in the words of Charlie Munger,
the basic rule on incentives is you get what you reward for. So if you have a dumb incentive system, you get dumb outcomes.
So again, challenge everything. This is extremely important. And let's talk about me and you now. We are going to run a channel here that is based on science, is based on research, is based on data, and is based on backtest on top of my own experience to find out what is that works when investing. We're going to run experiments like we did today that will bring up what actually is a good way to invest. And we're going to do it a lot and then a lot more. And the reason for that is if we are going to repeat it so far, eventually we're going to get to a place where we're going to get a Jindex leaderboard. And with that Jindex leaderboard, we're going to figure out what kind of factors are important, what kind of indices work better, what kind of other factors will come in and maybe help our volatility. We're going to do this and more on this channel. So if you like what you see today, if you like this kind of thinking, please subscribe. We're going to get back with you every time I have the chance to record a video. And I promise it's going to be one fun ride. I am Alberto. Again, we're here to find out the best long-term investing strategy. And if you're happy with us, I welcome on board. This is Jasper's Door.